The phone call came at 2 a.m., a voice Frank didn't recognize, reading from what sounded like a script. "Mr. Morrison, I'm calling about William Henderson. You were listed as his emergency contact." Frank's blood ran cold. Bill Henderson, the last man from his unit, the only other survivor of Firebase Charlie, the brother he'd been trying to reach for 3 months. The funeral was Tuesday. Closed casket, no military honors. The family had declined. Frank hung up the phone and wept for the first time since Margaret's death, not because Bill was gone, but because he'd died thinking no one remembered what he'd done in the mud and blood of Long Tan. Welcome to Anzac War Stories. Before we share this deeply personal tale of brotherhood, loss, and the bonds that time cannot break, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe the stories of our forgotten veterans deserve to be heard, please subscribe. Some promises are too important to break, even in death. Frank Morrison sat in his kitchen at 2:17 a.m., staring at the silent phone that had just shattered his world. The voice on the other end had been young, professional, detached, probably reading from a checklist. Next of kin unavailable. Emergency contact. Frank Morrison, Melbourne. Emergency contact. After 60 years, Bill Henderson had still listed him as the person to call. The irony cut deep. Frank had been trying to reach Bill for months, leaving messages with nursing homes across Queensland, following dead-end leads from RSL clubs. And all this time, Bill had been alone in a tiny flat in Cairns, with Frank's name and number written on a card in his wallet. Frank's hands shook as he reached for the kettle. Margaret always said that tea fixed everything, but she'd never had to face this particular kind of breaking. The funeral director had been matter-of-fact. "Small service, Mr. Morrison. Just a few distant relatives. They've requested no military ceremony." Apparently, Mr. Henderson never spoke much about his war service. Caused quite a bit of family friction over the years, from what I understand. No military ceremony. Frank closed his eyes and saw Bill as he'd been at 19. Cocky, fearless, the kind of soldier who'd charge a machine gun nest if you dared him to. The kind of man who'd carried 3 wounded mates through 2 clicks of enemy territory with a bullet in his own shoulder, then refused the medal because the boys who didn't make it deserved it more. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Frank had promised Bill something once, in a field hospital outside Saigon. They'd both been broken, Bill worse than Frank, and they'd made each other swear, "If something happens to me, make sure they know. Make sure someone remembers what we did here, what the boys died for." Frank had kept that promise for Margaret when she died. He'd stood at her funeral and told everyone about the woman who'd waited 2 years for a boy to come home from a war, who'd married him despite the nightmares and the silences, who'd polished his medals every Anzac Day even when he wanted to throw them away. Now it was Bill's turn, and Frank was the only one left who knew the real story. The drive to Cairns took Frank 12 hours, with stops every 2 hours because his doctor said his heart couldn't handle the stress. But some things were more important than doctor's orders. He'd loaded the car with everything he could find about Firebase Charlie: old unit photos, newspaper clippings, the citation for Bill's Distinguished Conduct Medal that Bill had never bothered to collect. The funeral home was exactly what Frank had expected: beige walls, artificial flowers, the kind of place that processed grief like an assembly line. The funeral director, a soft young man named Kevin, looked relieved when Frank introduced himself. "Mr. Morrison, thank goodness. We've been having trouble filling the service. Mr. Henderson's relatives are, well, let's say they have complicated feelings about his military service. His nephew mentioned something about drinking problems and angry outbursts. PTSD, you know." Frank felt his jaw tighten. PTSD. As if those 4 letters could explain away a lifetime of carrying ghosts. As if the nightmares and the drinking were character flaws instead of battle scars. "I'd like to see him," Frank said quietly. Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the casket is closed, Mr. Morrison. The family's wishes, and we're keeping the service quite brief, just immediate family, really. I hope you understand." Frank understood perfectly. He understood that Bill Henderson, who'd earned the thanks of a grateful nation, was going to be buried like a stranger. He understood that the family who'd spent 50 years being embarrassed by Bill's war service were now going to sanitize his death too. "I'll need time to speak," Frank said. It wasn't a request. Kevin consulted his clipboard. "Well, the nephew is saying a few words, and the priest will do a brief reading. We really don't have much time scheduled for." "I'll need time to speak," Frank repeated, and something in his voice made Kevin stop fiddling with his papers. St. Augustine's Catholic Church had seen better days. The afternoon light filtered through dusty stained glass, casting colored shadows across maybe 30 people scattered through pews that could hold 300. Frank sat in the back, watching Bill's relatives, people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The priest, Father Mackenzie, was elderly and kind but clearly reading from notes someone else had written. William Henderson lived a quiet life in our community. He was a devoted, he was a presence at the local RSL. He served his country in Vietnam, though he rarely spoke of those days. He will be remembered as a man who faced his challenges with dignity. Challenges. Frank wanted to laugh or cry or both. Bill's challenges had started the day he'd watched his best mate step on a mine outside Baria. They'd continued through the night. He'd single-handedly held a bunker against a company of NVA regulars while his unit evacuated wounded. They'd followed him home to a country that called him a baby killer, and a marriage that couldn't survive what he'd seen and done. Bill's nephew stood up next, a soft man in his 40s who looked like he'd never faced anything more challenging than a difficult customer. He read from a prepared statement about Bill's struggle with his demons and his inability to adjust to civilian life. He talked about Bill's drinking, his temper, his refusal to get help. He painted a picture of a man who'd been broken by war and never found his way back. Frank had heard enough. He stood slowly, his walking stick tapping against the pew as he made his way to the front of the church. The nephew looked annoyed. Father Mackenzie looked confused. But Frank had made a promise, and promises to the dead were sacred things. "My name is Frank Morrison," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Bill Henderson and I served together in Vietnam. We were in the same unit, the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. We were mates." He paused, looking out at the faces staring back at him, some curious, some impatient, some already checking their phones. "You've heard about Bill's problems, his drinking, his anger, his inability to adjust. All true, but you haven't heard about the night he saved my life and the lives of 3 other soldiers when we were pinned down at Firebase Charlie." Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. "It was October 12, 1968. We were on patrol near Long Tan when we walked into an ambush. The enemy had been tracking us for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to hit. They had us outnumbered 3-1, with the high ground in prepared positions. The church had gone completely quiet. Even the nephew had stopped fidgeting. 4 of us were caught in the open when the shooting started. No cover, nowhere to run. Bill Henderson had made it to the tree line when he saw us pinned down. Any sane man would have stayed put, called for backup, waited for artillery support. Bill threw away his rifle and ran straight into enemy fire to reach us. Frank's hands gripped his walking stick tighter. He dragged Tommy Walsh to cover first. Tommy had taken a round through the lung and was drowning in his own blood. Then he went back for Mickey Stevens, who'd been hit in both legs. Then Jimmy Patterson, who was unconscious with a head wound. By the time Bill came back for me, he'd been shot twice himself, but he wouldn't leave anyone behind. The nephew was staring now, his prepared speech forgotten. Bill carried us out one by one while Charlie threw everything they had at that position. Mortars, machine guns, rifle grenades. He made 4 trips through that killing field, and every time I thought it would be his last. But he kept coming back, because that's what Bill Henderson did. He never left a mate behind." Frank's voice cracked slightly. "Tommy Walsh died 3 days later in a field hospital. Mickey Stevens lost both legs but made it home. Jimmy Patterson recovered and became a teacher in Brisbane. He's got 5 kids and 12 grandkids now, and every one of them exists because Bill Henderson decided their grandfather's life was worth more than his own safety." The church was absolutely silent now. Even the sounds from the street seemed muted. The army wanted to give Bill the Victoria Cross for what he did that night. He refused it. Said the boys who didn't make it home deserved the medals, not him. "That's the kind of man your brother was," Frank said, looking directly at the nephew. "That's the kind of man your uncle was." Frank paused, gathering himself for the hardest part. Yes, Bill drank. Yes, he had a temper. Yes, he struggled with what we now call PTSD. But you know what? He had those problems because he was brave enough to do what needed doing when it mattered most. He carried the weight of every man he couldn't save, every friend he lost, every moment of that war for 60 years, and he did it alone, because the people who should have understood were too busy being embarrassed by his pain. The nephew was crying now, quiet tears running down his cheeks. Bill Henderson wasn't broken by the war, Frank continued. He was forged by it, shaped into the kind of man who would sacrifice everything for his mates, who would rather carry the burden of terrible memories than let his brothers die forgotten. The drinking, the anger, the nightmares, those weren't character flaws. They were the price he paid for being hero enough to do what heroes do. Frank looked around the church one last time. I was the last man from our unit still alive. Bill and I were the only survivors of Firebase Charlie. Now I'm the only one left who remembers that night, Who knows what really happened when 4 boys from Australia proved that mateship isn't just a word, it's a sacred trust. He turned to face Bill's casket, draped with its small Australian flag. I promised you once, mate, that if something happened, I'd make sure they knew, make sure someone remembered what we did there, what the boys died for. Well, they know now, and I'll keep telling them until there's no one left to listen. Frank made his way back to his pew in complete silence. The only sound was the soft weeping of people who'd just learned that they'd spent 50 years misunderstanding a hero.